Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to do something pretty interesting.
Yeah.
We're going to be taking a deep dive into the work of Andrei Martyanov.
A very, how shall I put it, colorful analyst.
Yeah, so for those who may not be familiar with him, he is a military analyst.
Yes.
And he's got a very unique background. Born in the Soviet Union, served as a naval officer, and now living and working in the U.S.
Yes, that's correct.
So he's got a very interesting perspective on geopolitics and military power.
Yeah, he's got a really interesting lens to kind of look at all this stuff through.
Yeah.
And he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he does not.
Not at all.
One of the things that I found most striking, and we'll get into this in more detail, is his argument that the West has already lost the arms race.
Yeah, that's one of his sort of big headline statements.
Yeah, and he's not talking about nuclear warheads or anything like that.
Well, and he very clearly makes the point that, the way that the West tends to think about military power is by looking at financial markets.
Right.
And he says that's totally the wrong way to look at it.
Yeah, he's like, you got to look at tangible industrial capacity.
Right. Like, can you make the stuff?
Yeah, can you actually build the things you need?
Exactly. Can you build it?
To fight a war.
Yeah. Can you produce the steel? Can you produce, the complex weapon systems?
Right.
The sort of mobilization potential.
Yeah, all that stuff.
All of that. That's what he says really underpins a nation's military strength.
Yeah, it's not just about having a big military budget. It's about what you can actually do with it.
You can have all the money in the world, but if you can't make the things you need to fight a war.
Right.
It doesn't really matter.
It's kind of like having all the ingredients for a gourmet meal, but no oven to cook it in.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So he points to this thing called the Composite Index of National Capability.
Yeah.
Have you looked at this at all?
I have. Yeah, it's a fascinating metric.
It's really interesting because it takes into account all these different factors that goes beyond just sort of, GDP and,
Economic indicators.
Yeah, it's basic economic indicators.
Yeah.
And it really gives you a more holistic picture of a nation's strengths.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting, too, that he brought up Jeffrey Barnett.
Yes.
Not to be confused with Thomas P.M. Barnett.
Right.
But Jeffrey Barnett has these 14 points for defining leadership in the world.
Yes.
And most of those points are directly tied to this idea of industrial capabilities.
Exactly. So, Martyanov's not the only one saying this. There are other people out there who are recognizing the importance of this.
Of this tangible capacity.
This tangible capacity.
So, okay, so we've talked a little bit about sort of this big picture idea of industrial capacity, but where does Russia fit into all of this?
Well, that's where Martyanov's analysis gets really spicy.
Yeah.
He offers a very scathing critique of Western analysts. And he argues that they fundamentally misunderstand Russia.
Okay.
He dismisses this narrative of Russia as a gas station.
Right.
He says, look at the country's self-sufficiency in terms of resources and manufacturing, especially within its military-industrial complex.
So he's saying that Russia is far more capable than many in the West give it credit for.
Oh, absolutely. He points to this sort of deep-seated mentality in Russia. He calls it the soldier, and it's a fight mentality.
Okay.
And he says this is something that's ingrained in Russian history and culture. And the West consistently fails to grasp it.
Interesting.
He even links this back to the West's interpretation of the Soviet collapse.
Okay.
He says, the West was so focused on declaring victory that they failed to actually analyze what had happened.
It's almost like they were blinded by their own assumptions about Russia.
Exactly. They had this narrative and they were determined to fit everything into that narrative.
Right.
Regardless of what the facts on the ground were actually saying.
Yeah, it's this echo chamber effect that he talks about. It's like these modern analysts are just trapped in their own worldview.
Yeah, and they're unable to process information that challenges that worldview.
Right.
And this leads them to make really bad decisions because they're not seeing the world clearly.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how much our own preconceived notions influence how we view the world.
Absolutely.
Especially in areas where we don't have firsthand knowledge.
It's really something to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
How much are we letting our own biases shape our understanding of what's going on?
Right. And is that leading us to make, potentially bad decisions or, misread situations?
Right. Because if you're starting from a flawed premise, you're going to end up with flawed conclusions.
Right. Exactly.
But, it's not just sort of the average Western analyst that Martyanov has a problem with. He's particularly critical of the intellectual elite.
The so-called experts.
Yeah, the so-called Russia experts.
Yeah.
He doesn't mince words.
No, he does not.
He's called some of them out by name.
Like who?
Well, for instance, he refers to Michael McFaul,
Okay.
who's a very prominent Russia expert.
Right, I know who he is, yeah.
He calls him a certified moron.
Wow.
Yeah.
He's clearly not holding back.
No, he is not.
So why is he so dismissive of these experts?
Well, he argues that many of them lack a real understanding of economics and the complexities of modern Russia.
Okay.
And this, he believes, has led to disastrous policy decisions.
So he's saying that their lack of understanding has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. He uses John Mearheimer as an example.
Okay.
Mearheimer is considered a realist in international relations.
Right.
But even Mearheimer viewed Russia as a declining state.
Okay.
Which is a viewpoint that Martyanov vehemently disagrees with.
So even someone who's supposed to be, a realist is still getting it wrong, according to Martyanov.
Yes.
Interesting.
And he says this is because they're all working with these flawed assumptions about Russia and about its capabilities.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, how much do our own experts shape our understanding of the world?
Yeah, especially in areas where we didn't have firsthand knowledge.
Right, exactly. Like we're relying on these people to tell us what's going on.
To interpret the information for us.
And if you're getting it wrong, then we're getting it wrong.
Right, and that can have, serious implications.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this actually leads into another really unsettling aspect of Martyanov's analysis.
Okay.
He's got some very strong views on Russophobia in the West.
Okay, this is something I've heard him talk about before.
Yeah, he goes beyond just fear, and he describes it as outright hatred.
That's a strong statement.
It is.
What does he base this on?
Well, he sees a real disconnect between how Russia has historically shaped Western civilization and the way the West views it today.
So he's saying there's a historical element to this.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
He points to the West's self-destruction through 2 world wars and its persistent prejudice against Slavs.
Okay.
And he believes this Russophobia manifests in many ways.
Does he give any specific example?
Oh, he does.
Okay, like what?
Well, he mentions the incident in the Canadian Parliament where a Ukrainian Nazi was honored.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty disturbing.
Yeah.
So he's saying this is happening even at institutional levels.
Yes, exactly. And he also talks about the continued celebration of anti-Russian Nazi units in some European countries. So, these are not just isolated incidents. This is something that's much deeper and more pervasive.
It certainly challenges our perceptions.
Yeah.
It forces us to examine where our own views on Russia and its people come from. Are they based on facts, or are they influenced by this deeply ingrained narrative?
Right. Are we letting our own biases shape our understanding of what's going on?
Right.
And, Martyanov doesn't just stop at criticizing the West.
Okay.
He also offers a pretty bleak assessment of Europe's current state and future prospects.
Oh, this should be interesting.
Yeah, he's not very optimistic about Europe.
What's his take?
Well, he sees Europe as a deindustrialized region.
Okay.
Plagued by corrupt elites.
Okay.
And a declining standard of living.
Okay, so not a very rosy picture.
Not at all.
So what does he think is going to happen to Europe?
Well, he uses a very potent analogy. He talks about declining European car sales in the U.S.
Okay.
Remember when European cars were seen as like the gold standard?
Yeah, back in the day.
Yeah. And now they're being outcompeted.
By who?
By Asian manufacturers, by American manufacturers.
Okay.
And he sees this as a symptom of a broader decline. He's essentially saying that Europe is losing its edge.
On the world stage.
On the world stage. And he goes even further. He states that Europe is more of an object than a subject in international relations.
Okay, so he's saying they don't have agency.
They don't have agency.
They're not in control of their own destiny.
They're a pawn in the U.S.'s game, so to speak.
Wow.
And so this lack of agency combined with all these internal issues, paints a pretty grim picture of Europe's future.
Yeah, that's a pretty sobering assessment.
It is.
Especially considering, the current geopolitical climate.
Yeah.
It raises a lot of questions about, Europe's role in the world and its ability to navigate the challenges ahead.
Absolutely.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is what Martyanov has to say about the concept of neutrality.
Okay.
Especially given the current conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because, Martyanov's observations about Ukraine are quite striking.
Okay.
He highlights the fact that Russia no longer uses the term brotherly people when referring to Ukrainians.
That's interesting. Like, that's a very deliberate choice of words.
It is.
Or lacks thereof in this case.
Right. And it really speaks to the severity of the current divide.
Right. So the relationship has fundamentally changed.
It has. And he predicts a partitioning of Ukraine.
Okay.
With a small neutralized remnant state remaining.
So he's not really seeing a possibility for a unified Ukraine going forward.
No, not really.
Okay, so that's a pretty stark prediction.
It is.
And it kind of makes you wonder, like, does he see any possibility for a peaceful resolution?
He doesn't seem optimistic.
Okay.
In fact, he makes a very pointed statement.
Okay, what's that?
He says that Russia can annihilate Brussels in 15 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful image.
It is.
So he's basically saying the geography doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
In modern warfare.
Exactly.
That these traditional buffer zones are increasingly irrelevant.
Yes.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
And it raises the question, how do we ensure security in a world where those traditional defenses seem increasingly irrelevant?
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves, and it's this kind of thought-provoking analysis that makes Martyanov's perspective so valuable.
Even if it's unsettling.
Even if it's unsettling.
Right.
He's forcing us to confront the complexities of a rapidly changing world.
And to really think critically about the assumptions that we're making.
Exactly.
Yeah, wow, this has been a lot to take in.
It has.
But it's been really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's important to engage with these kinds of ideas.
Absolutely.
Even if they're challenging.
Yeah.
Because it helps us, broaden our understanding of the world.
Right, and to think about things in new ways.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess we'll leave it there for now.
Okay.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. But be sure to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.